Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we are continuing our review of the Psion. This is the new Unearthed Arcana that was released recently by Wizards of the Coast. This is playtest material. We started off looking at just the Psion base class, then their spell list and their new spells and adjusted spells that appeared in that Unearthed Arcana, as well as we looked at the two other subclasses, the Metamorph and the Psi Warper in our last video. In this video, we're going to take a look at the two additional subclasses because they're supposedly being released with 4 if this all goes official. These are the Psykinetic as well as the Telepath. We'll have one more video after this looking at some of the sort of new origin feats that will supposedly be released with the Psion whenever it comes out in whatever book it comes out in. But this video is just about the Psykinetic and the Telepath subclasses, so really without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into it, starting with the Psykinetic Summary. So the Psykinetic says that they can mold psionic force for creation and destruction. A Psykinetic controls their psionic powers like a malleable force. They bend their telekinetic energies into sturdy barriers and strike with a force of a battering ram. When I made the Psion base class video, I made some predictions about what each subclass would do just based on their name because I hadn't read the whole Unearthed Arcana yet. Here's what I had to say about the Psykinetic. Psykinetic is for sure a blaster of some kind. It seems I might have been only half right about this one because this says that they're going to be creating like sturdy barriers like force fields and things like that. So I thought that they were just going to be a straight up blaster, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. So I was like, okay, with this context, I might expect like things that grant temporary hit points or maybe like an arcane wards sort of feature or the ability to create like actual physical barriers like a wall of force, or not physical because wall of force is force, but you know what I mean, like actual barriers. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump into their actual features, starting with the Psykinetic subclass spell list. Looking at this spell list, we have at level 3, Cloud of Daggers, Levitate, Shield, and Thunderwave. So far, this is the only Psion that has access to the Shield spell, which I think is just generally unfortunate. At level 5, you get Slow and Telekinetic Crush. Telekinetic Crush is one of their new spells. I covered that in the Psion base class video. It's basically like a cubic fireball that does slightly less damage in a slightly smaller area and also knocks affected creatures prone. At level 7, you get Odaluk's Resilient Sphere and Stone Shape. And then at level 9, you get Telekinesis and Wall of Force. So one thing I've been pointing out in all of the different spell lists is that first, Telekinetic Crush is a verbal only component, which means that for the Psion specifically, it is basically a subtle spell because they can ignore verbal components on their Psion spells. There are no spells on this spell list that have a costly or consumed material component, so there's nothing to look out for there. And then for spells that aren't normally on the Psion spell list, we have everything here highlighted in green. So that is most of this spell list that is new to the Psykinetic Psion, so that's actually pretty exciting. I always like seeing spells that aren't on a base class being added to these subclasses just to, again, add to the sort of subclass expression. I think Cloud of Daggers is a fun spell in 2024 because it's guaranteed damage. There's no saving throw against it, and you can move it around as your magic action on each of your turns. So that's a pretty fun one, especially at the levels when you get it. I think Stone Shape feels like a weird inclusion. I know that it says that you can create barriers and things like that, but creating actual like stone barriers or like carving out an area of stone is not something that sort of would have been on my radar. And of course we have Wall of Force here, but the fact that Wall of Force isn't on the Psion spell list just normally, even though they also have Force Gauge, which is basically like a better version of the same thing. I'm a little surprised that isn't already on the Psion spell list. And I'm also just generally surprised by the lack of like other blaster type spells. Of course, I mean, Telekinetic Crush is there, but Telekinetic Crush is already on the Psion spell list. Other than that, you really just, I mean, Thunderwave is fine. Cloud of Daggers is fun, but you know, there's no like, I would have expected maybe like Magic Missile. I also maybe would have expected that this class would maybe break sort of the sort of rules of Psionics and include maybe some like lightning damage or something along those lines. Even just more instances of like things that do thunder damage, anything along those lines that could maybe that sort of bend the rules that everything isn't necessarily inherently psionic or like you know psychic or maybe even force damage. It's still a solid spell list, so let's go and look at the next feature. Again, at level 3 we have Telekinetic Techniques. It says when you use your Telekinetic Propel, that is your bonus action push and pull, you can impose one of the following effects on that target. First, you have boost. It says the target's speed increases by 10 feet until the start of your next turn. That is increases, not decreases. And then you have disorient. The target can't make opportunity attacks until the start of its next turn. And then telekinetic bolt. If the target fails the saving throw, it takes force damage equal to the number rolled on the psionic energy die. So if they fail the saving throw, they are pushed or pulled however much distance you push or pull them, in addition to taking some amount of force damage. What I really like about this feature is that the boost feature increases increases the target speed, which means that Wizards of the Coast is leaning into their own 2024 design where we can now choose to fail saving throws. So if we use our telekinetic propel on our allies, they can choose to fail that saving throw, be moved however many feet that we move them, and then their speed also increases by 10 feet until the start of our next turn. So when they take their turn, they have a little more movement to get into position. So I like that a lot. I do feel like Disorient is maybe a little bit limited in how often I would use it. One thing that you can note here is that regardless of pass or fail on these first two, Disorient and Boost, the effect happens regardless of whether or not they fail the saving throw. So if there's like a creature right next to you and you're trying to push them away using your telekinetic propel, but they make that saving throw, they still cannot make opportunity attacks. So that might be the only reason that I might use this one if I'm trying to get away from them, but the push fails and they're still right next to me. But failing either of those options, you still have telekinetic bolt, where if they fail the saving throw, you can just deal some force damage to them. When I first read this feature, I was like, this kind of feels a little bit more like a Psy Warper feature because you are basing it off the telekinetic propel, is based around moving creatures and enemies around. Again, I was still very much expecting the Psykinetic to be much more of a blaster. So this first feature, kind of playing chess the way that the Psy Warper was a little surprising to me. And while every other Psion subclass has 2 level 3 abilities, this one only has 1, which is a little unfortunate. Maybe there's room for some growth if they want to make it a little bit more of a blaster. But let's go ahead and move on to the level 6 feature called Empowered Attack Mode. So Attack Mode, if you haven't read the Psion Unearthed Arcana, is a base class feature. It works very, very similarly to the innate sorcery of the Sorcerer in 2024, where it's a bonus action for a minute and you get some extra bonuses while that duration is going. This is an empowered version of the attack mode. There's an attack mode and a defense mode. You choose one when you go into that. So Empowered Attack Mode says while your attack mode is active, you gain a fly speed of 60 feet and can hover. When you cast a Psion spell, you can add your intelligence modifier to 1 damage roll of that spell. So in the Psion base class video, it's kind of a little critical of the Psionic mode feature. This is something that you get at level 2. It's probably one of 2 features that the Psion base class has that you're kind of built around. The other, of course, being the Psionic energy die. And while I think that the attack mode and defense mode and the Psion modes in general are probably a little underwhelming for me, this is a pretty good way to make that better. So 60 foot of fly speed is basically the fly spell. With hover also is very great because that means you can't be knocked prone to be knocked out of the air. And applying extra damage to all of our Psion spells is pretty welcome as well, especially for AoE spells that hit multiple targets. That extra damage gets multiplied across them. And remember that our Psionic Surge can be used to, when we roll initiative, we can expend one of our hit die to then restore one of our uses of our Psionic mode. So if we want to use attack mode in an upcoming combat when we roll initiative, we can sacrifice a hit die to restore a use of that with no action required. So if I'm effectively expending a hit die to give myself the fly spell and more damage on my spells, I think that's an absolutely great use. That's definitely going to not only save myself from probably taking some damage, but also, cause some creatures to die earlier than normal because they're taking a little bit more damage, which is also a form of damage prevention, right? A dead creature can't do damage. So while I was kind of critical of the Psionic modes, I think this is objectively a good improvement. I'm not saying that I still like Psionic modes. I just think that this is a good feature. So then moving on to the other level 6 feature, we have Rebounding Field. It says when you cast Shield in response to being hit by an attack roll and cause the triggering attack to miss, you can expend 1 Psionic energy die to launch force back at the attacker. The attacker makes a dexterity saving throw, roll 2 Psionic energy dice. On a failed save, the attacker takes force damage equal to the amount rolled, and you gain temporary hit points equal to that amount as well. On a successful save, the attacker takes half as much damage only. So first things first, I don't see any reason why this would not apply to also blocking the magic missile spell with the shield spell. That seems a bit like a weird exclusion to me. This is probably not a great use of Psionic Surge to add just like a little bit more damage or a little bit more temporary hit points, because again, that Psionic Surge is sacrificing your hit die, unless of course you know that that damage is going to drop that creature to 0 or help drop that creature to 0 before the start of their next turn, because again, then you're preventing the damage that they would be doing anyway. And again, this probably doesn't work with Enkindled Life Force because it does only expend 1, but it rolls 2. And I think Enkindled Life Force only works if you expend 1 and roll 1, but I'm not quite clear on that. And this is the third Psion subclass we've seen so far that has 2 level 6 features. And again, most of the other subclasses as well have 2 level 3 features. And if you remember from the Psion base class video, they stopped getting net new features after level 7. They have like improved versions of existing features at levels 10 and 17, but they stopped getting, again, net new features at level 7. So this is actually making the Psion subclass feel extremely front-loaded, even more so than probably most other classes are. Basically, by the time you're level 7, you more or less have everything that you're going to ever have as a Psion. You really only have 3 features left. You have your 2 other subclass features as well as your capstone, and that's it, at least as far as new features go. But with all that aside, let's go ahead and move on to the level 10 feature for the Psykinetic. It's called Enhanced Telekinetic Crush. It says when you cast Telekinetic Crush, which again is their level 3 spell, you can expend 1 Psionic energy die to modify that spell, so whether a creature fails or succeeds on the saving throw against the spell, its speed is halved until the start of your next turn. So Telekinetic Crush normally deals some damage, and affected creatures are knocked prone as well. But whether or not they fail or save against that spell, their speed is halved until the start of your next turn. So being able to guarantee some sort of effect on a creature is an inherently powerful effect. I do feel like this is a little underwhelming for me. It's really going to depend on how much movement there actually is in your encounters. Usually the thing about instantaneous spells like a fireball is that once that fireball goes off, if the enemy likes their position and where they are, they have no incentive to move anyway. And while I'm certain that there are circumstances where you can use this and get some value out of it, I think if you're just kind of firing it blindly, there will be times where you do it, and getting that speed halved just inherently doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't happen automatically, but if you do expend the psionic energy die to do it and then no one moves and you get no value out of it, there's going to be some feel bads there, I guess. What I might have expected here is something like an empowered defense mode. That's something that I thought of when I was creating this slide. That might like reduce the creature speed by like 10 or by half when they're damaged by one of our psionic spells or something like that, but apparently that's not what we got. So then moving on to the psykinetic capstone, we have something called heightened telekinesis. It says when you cast telekinesis, you can expend 4 psionic energy die to modify the spell so that it doesn't require concentration. If you do so, the spell's duration becomes 1 minute for that casting, and you can target gargantuan creatures and objects. And again, here I was a little underwhelmed. The best thing that this is doing is protecting your concentration on the spell by removing the concentration from it. And again, this is on a class that otherwise has very little ways to protect their concentration. Telekinesis is a really fun spell. It's a very good spell as well for controlling and moving creatures around. However, the part about like targeting gargantuan creatures and objects might not feel like as good as it might be, because gargantuan creatures typically also have very high strength saving throw bonuses. It's not necessarily impossible for them to fail. It might be a little bit more difficult than you might think, especially if they also have like the magic resistance, so they have advantage on saving throws against spells. And again, while concentration free telekinesis is good, telekinesis requires you to use your magic action on each subsequent turn to keep using the telekinesis feature. So all it's really doing is protecting your concentration by removing it, but it's not really allowing you to do more than you normally would, like removing the concentration on a summon spell would, where that summon is still running around and you can then cast another concentration spell on your next turn and do things with that. If you cast this version of telekinesis and then you want to concentrate on another spell as well, then you are basically taking the turn off of doing something with telekinesis, because that also requires your action. So ideally, you'd basically want to cast a concentration spell first, and then on your next turn, cast this version of telekinesis so that you already have this other concentration spell going, but then you spend the rest of the time using your telekinesis to move things around. So I think it's a little awkward in that manner. This is a good feature, but I don't think it's as good as it should be for a capstone feature, if that makes sense. So for my initial impressions of the Psykinetic, in retrospect, I feel like my predictions were actually pretty off here. I was expecting them to be much more of a blaster because I was really focused on the kinetic in Psykinetic. I was like, okay, kinetic energy, like Gambit from the X-Men, they're going to be throwing like blasting things around. I was expecting like magic missile. I was expecting all of these different like blaster features. It's not quite what we got. They're a lot more defensive oriented. They can throw a little bit more damage around, but it's not to the level that I was expecting. Again, I think the telekinetic techniques is probably my favorite feature because of the way that it shows that Wizards of the Coast is leaning into their own design, by the fact that we can now choose to fail our own saving throws, which means that we can use certain features and spells on our allies that can benefit them that they might have not been able to do so before as reliably. I will say that I also don't like the fact that 3 of the 5 features that they get are centered around one spell or one spell each. Like we have one for the shield spell, we have one for telekinetic crush, and we have another for, telekinesis. I mean, all those spells are on your psykinetic spell list, so it's not like you need to go out of your way to get them. And if there's like one feature that does that on a subclass, that's perfectly fine. But now like 3 of my subclass features are based around one spell each. And so I feel like if I'm not going out of my way to cast those spells, then I'm not really justifying my choice to be that subclass. And so overall, I'm actually just a little bit underwhelmed, and that might just be because, I had much different expectations of what the Psykinetic would be. But overall, this just kind of feels like a step down from both the Metamorph and the Psywarper. I think the Psywarper is just like the perfect class for my kind of playstyle and the kind of caster that I would want to play. The Metamorph I just thought was just thematically very cool, even though it might be a little squishy. And while the Psykinetic is certainly doing things, I don't think it's a bad subclass by any means. I just don't think it quite reaches the level of the other 2 that we've looked at already. That's the Psykinetic. Let's go ahead and move on to the Telepath. So starting with the Telepath Summary, it says that they are a master of tactics in the landscape of the mind. Telepaths are masters of mind magic. They use their psionic powers for all matters of the mind, whether they bolster the mental defenses of allies or probe the thoughts of others undetected. A telepath can be a bastion of psionic aid or a crafty manipulator. So again, for my final prediction that I made in the Psion base class video, this is what I thought about the Telepath. And then Telepath is kind of hard to gauge, but I imagine it maybe focuses on a lot of illusion and divination and probably even enchantment spells, like your modify memories, detect thoughts, locate creatures, that sort of thing. Connecting, your mind to someone else's mind to do something. And this seems to be mostly in line with my initial prediction. The one thing that I wasn't expecting was the ability to bolster allies. I thought this would be much more of like a get into your enemy's mind and sort of like do like inception on them and like control their mind, you know, sort of like dominate spells or control spells, and basically very enchantment based, possibly divination based, possibly maybe some illusion as well. But let's see how we did. So moving into the first level 3 feature, of course we have the Telepath spell list. At level 3 we have spells like Bane, Command, Detect Thoughts, and Mind Spike. Level 5 gets you Counterspell and Speak with Plants. I guess that's a weird inclusion. Level 7 gives you Compulsion and Confusion, and then level 9 gives you Awaken and Modify Memory. So one thing to note, as we've done in all of the other spell lists, is that Command is a verbal only component, which means that it's totally subtle for the Psion. They can cast it without being detected. Secondly, the Awaken spell does have a costly and consumed component, so if they want to use the Awaken spell, assuming that the DM is enforcing the material component for this spell, they would need to present that when they're doing this. And then additionally, the Bane, Counterspell, and Speak with Plants spell are the only spells that are not normally on the Psion spell list. So that's kind of a shame. I was a little disappointed that most of these are on the Psion spell list, although that just might be the nature of the subclass, basically doing all the things that Psions want to be doing anyway. So that might be just a reflection of that. And again, you do always have these spells prepared. They don't count towards your number of spells prepared. So these are just spells that, even though they are on your spell list, you do just always have access to them anyway, and you don't need to pick them up when you level up in Psion. I do think that Speak with Plants is a weird inclusion. Again, I don't know why that's there unless it's there to strictly lead into Awaken. I don't know if you need to get permission from the plants to awaken them. I don't believe you need to, but again, if someone knows that there's a lore reason that Psions can speak with plants, definitely let me know. Like, they don't even have minds necessarily, so what are you telepathing to? I don't have a problem with it, I just think it's funny. So then moving on to the other level 3 feature, we have Mind Infiltrator. This says when you cast Detect Thoughts, you can expend 2 psionic energy die to modify the spell so that it doesn't require components or concentration. Also, the target doesn't know you're probing its mind if it fails the wisdom saving throw. So this is basically exactly what I was expecting from an early feature of this subclass. If you remember from the base Psion, the first 2 level 1 features are basically giving you a modified version of the telekinetic feat and the telepathic feat. And part of the telepathic feat is that you get Detect Thoughts with no components, but they can't give you Detect Thoughts at level 1 because it's a second level spell, which you wouldn't get until level 3. So getting this on the telepath is very predictable. This is something we definitely saw coming. You know, how useful a spell like this can vary wildly from one moment to the next, or one DM to the next even. However, I wouldn't be surprised to see like other features in this subclass based off like this feature as well. Like, while you have Detect Thoughts on an enemy, you can do something else to them. But then moving on to our next level 3 feature, we have Telepathic Hub. This one says you have telepathy with a range of 10 feet. When you expend a psionic energy die as part of using telepathic connection to increase the range of your telepathy or the duration of the effect, you can simultaneously contact a number of creatures equal to 1 plus the number rolled on the psionic energy die. You have a larger range of passive telepathy, and when you increase that range by spending the psionic energy die, you can contact multiple creatures at the same time, 1 plus the roll on the die. I do find that first sentence a little strange because telepathic connection again already gives us 5 feet of passive telepathy. I feel like it should say something like the normal range of your telepathic connection increases to 10 feet, because this way it just feels like you have 2 different versions of telepathy. You have the 5-foot one and you have the 10-foot one. And when I was looking at the Psion base class, I was kind of critical of telepathic connection because I was like, the message cantrip is basically just better than this, and then Rary's telepathic bond is much better than this. So while I think that this feature does make using that feature a little bit more useful than the message cantrip, this is still very much outshined by Rary's telepathic bond. But again, much like the first level 3 feature, when I was making this slide, I was like, maybe we'd also see features in the subclass also based around this one, because the description, the summary for the telepath also said that we could bolster our allies' minds as well. So if you have a telepathic connection with them, maybe you're also able to affect them that way. So when I made this slide at the time, that was actually one of my predictions as well. So then moving on to our level 6 features, we have Empowered Defense Mode. And this is how you know that I make these slides one at a time, because I just talked about Empowered Defense Mode on the Psykinetic on their level 10 ability. I was like, this should just be like an Empowered Defense Mode, so they can choose between Empowered Attack or Empowered Defense. But Empowered Defense Mode for the telepath says while your defense mode is active, whenever you make a saving throw, you add 1d4 to the save, so like a passive bless effect, but it doesn't affect your attacks. In addition, while your defense mode is active, you can extend this benefit to creatures you are telepathically connected to using your telepathic connection. So basically, like I just said in the previous slide, we see a feature now that is using one of our first level 3 features and building upon that. Not only do we have a passive bonus to our own saving throws, but if we also use this to expand our telepathic connection to our allies within range, we basically have this sort of aura or emanation around us effectively that is adding 1d4 to the save. So if you also have like a paladin in your party, they have that bonus as well, plus their aura. So quite a few bonuses that you could get to your saves, especially if you and that paladin are higher level and they have their expanded aura. You can get a lot of bonuses to your saves that way. And now I would say, even if you have Rary's telepathic bond, that telepathic connection is now actually a decent feature. It took quite a bit, but we finally got there. So moving on to the other level 6 feature, we have something called Potent Thoughts. It says you add your intelligence modifier to the damage you deal with any Psion cantrip. This is basically your potent cantrip, as you would see like on the cleric, as well as the druid has a version of this as well. And while I think most people know this already, again, this is particularly good with True Strike because that means you are double dipping on your intelligence modifier for damage, because your weapon damage will use your intelligence modifier as well as the additional damage from Potent Thoughts. So your intelligence modifier gets added twice to the damage. Moving on then to level 10, we have Telepathic Bolstering. It says you have telepathy out to 30 feet, and when you or a creature you can see within range of your telepathy fails an ability check or misses with an attack roll, you can take a reaction to expend one psionic energy die, roll the die, and add the number rolled to the d20, potentially turning a failed check into a success or a miss into a hit. The psionic energy die is only expended if the check succeeds or the attack hits. So again, I think the phrasing of the first sentence here is a little strange, similar to the one before, because the Psion already gives us 5 feet of passive telepathy, so I feel like it should be worded to that it's expanding that telepathy out to 30 feet. It's not really an important change, but I just feel like it's an important syntactical change at least. And in the original Unearthed Arcana for 1D&D, what was basically the 2024 playtest for the new rule set, bards for their bardic inspiration used them as a reaction, much like this does. So it seems like they decided not to give that to the bards, but they built it into this telepath subclass for the Psion instead. Of course, we can't use this one with saving throws like we could with bardic inspiration. This is just ability checks and attack rolls, but still it's a reaction when you see something fail, which I think is just kind of a really good system. I think the die only being expended if the check or attack hits or succeeds is a really good form of efficiency, and this would actually be a decent use of Psionic Surge or even Enkindled Life Force if the attack is important enough that you know you want it to hit, and especially if you know that the use of Psionic Surge to give it a +1 to 3 depending on the roll will cause that attack to hit. The Enkindled Life Force adding 2d12, basically guaranteeing that attack will hit depending on what the base roll is. So certainly not a bad feature. This is probably one of the better features on this class. I think I do really like the fact that it is built around actually having this expanded telepathy range. Again, turning one of the features I didn't like about the base class into something that's actually, fun to use. But finally, let's get to the Telepath Capstone, where we have Scrambled Minds. It says when you cast Confusion, you can expend 4 psionic energy die to modify the spell so that the radius of the spell's sphere becomes 30 feet. Again, a 30-foot radius, so a 60-foot diameter. In addition, creatures under the effects of the spell roll 2d10s, and then you choose which roll determines their behavior on their turns. So the way that Confusion works is that affected creatures on their turn, you roll a d10, and then there's a table in the description of the spell that says what they do. Usually it's similar to Command, where they do something and then their turn ends. But on a roll of a 9 or a 10, they can choose to do what they want to do on their turn, so there's a chance that doesn't really do anything to them anyway. So that was always the worst part about the Confusion spell, that they basically have a 20% chance to just not be affected by the spell, even though they are affected by the spell. However, the fact that you basically get to roll with advantage through this feature lowers that 20% chance to a 4% chance, because now the only results that you don't want to see are a 9 and a 10, a 10 and a 10, a 10 and a 9, and a 9 and a 9. That's only 4 out of 100 possible outcomes that you don't want to see. So while it isn't impossible, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a result that you, again, don't want to see. A 7 or 8 on the die can still result in an ally getting attacked if they're within range, because the creature then, what they have to do is make a melee attack against a random target within range. But for that reason, if there are other enemies within range of that creature, then they could also just attack them as well, and that will help you. So as many times as it's going to hurt you, it can also help you in that way. I will say another thing about this is that I feel like it took a little bit of time to actually get to the sort of like mind control, not really mind control, but just like, affecting your enemies' minds by doing something like that. Basically, all the other features of this subclass built upon bolstering your allies by connecting your minds to the telepathic connection, and this is basically the only feature that affects your enemies other than the detect thoughts. So again, we kind of took a while, but we finally got there. So my initial impressions for the telepath is that this is a lot more of a support caster than I was expecting. Again, I wasn't expecting like a big blaster for the telepath, but again, I was expecting a lot more focus on like enchantment and illusion spells, using your mind magic a little bit more offensively rather than the sort of defensive nature that we saw in the subclass. And because they were kind of split in two, I do think that there's an argument that the telepath is maybe trying to do too much, that there's not enough of the sort of enchantment or attacking your enemies' minds as we might have expected from a class like this. I feel like that theme is a bit underrepresented in this subclass, but I think that this also means that there's just room for another subclass in the future that does just that thing. And for that reason, maybe they want to dial back on that part of this subclass and instead just make them more of a dedicated support caster. Again, the buffs to the telepathic connection were welcome. I still think the base feature is a little bit underwhelming and could be better, but I do like the way that the telepath builds upon it. And again, much like the psykinetic, nothing in this subclass is particularly amazing. Again, I do like the expanding their mind and buffing all the saving throws is also very cool too. It's still a very solid subclass. I'm just not nearly as excited about this one or the psykinetic as much as I was about the metamorph, or certainly the Psy Warper, which again is my favorite so far, because again, it just does everything that I'd want a caster to do. So those are all of the Psion subclasses subclasses that were released in this Unearthed Arcana. Again, we have the Metamorph and the Psywarper in my previous video. We have the Psykinetic and the Telepath in this video. That is everything that I thought, but I want to know what you think about these subclasses, particularly, again, the Telepath and the Psykinetic that we covered here. What parts really hit for you? What parts do you feel like were a bit underwhelming? Again, do you think that the Telepath should focus more just being on a support build and that they should just let another class be sort of that enchantment mind control sort of subclass instead? I feel like I would rather have that than this one subclass that is trying to do both, but maybe isn't doing enough of either. You can let me know all that and more in the comments down below. And while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.